On December 26, 2016, Sue and Ken Allen and their family embarked on a journey nearly halfway around the world and back in time about 6,000 years. The entourage consisted of Sue and Ken, their son Keith, their daughter and son-in-law Rachel and David Dimmick, her 3 children Ashley Mills, Megan Mills, and Spencer Mills, and David's 2 boys Dawson and Ryan Dimmick. These are excerpts from the journal Sue kept along the way. December 27, 2016. Starting in Salt Lake City, we flew to Chicago and then changed planes and flew on Royal Jordanian Airlines to Amman, Jordan. We arrived in Jordan exhausted about 5 o'clock in the early evening, got through customs, into a hotel, and ate a buffet dinner. We were all pretty exhausted and promptly went to sleep. The next morning, after a buffet breakfast in the hotel, we found our guide Ben and our bus driver Mahmoud. A 3-hour drive down through the desert landscape of Jordan and then up into the mountains to the west brought us into the region of Petra. We first stopped at Wadi Musa, the traditional spring where Moses struck the rock and caused water to spring forth to feed his people during the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. This is told in Exodus 17. Arriving at the gates of Petra, we walked down into it through a long Sheikh. Sheikh is the Arab word for canyon. It's quite the canyon, walls several hundred feet high and in places only 10 feet wide. It's quite an amazing place. Petra was founded and built out by a people called the Nabateans, who dwelt there during the early Roman era, and Petra was a mountain pass at the crossroads of major trade routes east of the Dead Sea between Arabia, Egypt, and Syria. Along the Sheikh are many stone carvings. There are places where Nabatean idols are carved in the rocks. There are many small shrines. There's a life-sized carving of several camels and a caravan, although most of it is washed away. Coming out of the Sheikh, we come upon the Treasury, a spectacular facade in the side of a cliff facing the mouth of the Sheikh. It is magnificent, 38 meters tall and 34 meters wide. We couldn't go inside, but it's just 3 empty rooms at ground level. It is believed it was actually originally some kind of church. Below ground level are newly discovered and recently excavated chambers, evidently tombs, like in much of the rest of this vast town. Turning right and walking down through the canyon, the field opens up to reveal many more elaborate tombs in the canyon walls. Further on, the field opens up into a larger valley, with a bricked aqueduct down the middle. A large amphitheater on the left seats about 4,000 people. But unlike most amphitheaters, which are built out of stacked stones, this one was just carved into the side of the hill. Opposite the amphitheater is what is called the Tomb of the Kings. It is a series of magnificent facades with huge chambers that served as tombs carved into the high rock wall, far up the right-hand side of the valley. Below is a colonnade, which used to be the city center. 20 to 30,000 people originally lived in Petra, until a large earthquake in 749 AD leveled most of the city. Many people were killed. The survivors all moved away, abandoning the site. Still, buildings from the Roman era survive today. We walked up to the basilica opposite the colonnade. It has beautiful mosaic floors. The architecture of Petra is so interesting because its first structures date from about 50 BC, and work continued for another 100 to 200 years. There are influences from Egyptian architecture and from Greek and Roman styles. Ryan's favorite part of Petra was going into one of the huge tombs and seeing the pattern on the rock on the ceiling. Ashley thought the treasury was really cool. "I've never seen anything like it," she said. Rachel said a bit sarcastically that her favorite part was all the walking. We walked 10 kilometers. Ken ended up on a horse for the last kilometer coming out. He was tired. That was our whole day. Thursday, December 29th, 2016. Thursday, December 29th was a day of travel, as we rode a bus from Amun to Jerusalem through the border at the famous Allenby Bridge across the Jordan River. It isn't much of a river to cross at that point. The Jordan River water is so heavily used that there was very little water flowing down the wide valley. We arrived at the Ramada Inn Hotel in Jerusalem, checked into our rooms, and decided to do a little exploring for lunch. We found a neighborhood to-go restaurant and had lentil soup and sandwiches. We then walked up the street to see an amazing railway bridge with one tall, swooping pillar holding up all the cables. It's just a small bridge for the local streetcars, but it has an architectural design unlike anything else. That evening for dinner, we had the usual hotel buffet, and then we met most of the rest of our tour group. Our leader was Daniel Rona. He's been leading tours in Israel for over 40 years. He was born in Israel, a true Israeli Jew, in 1941, but he immigrated with his father to the United States when he was about 7 years old after his parents divorced. He and his father joined the LDS Church a couple of years later. He grew up in New York, attended college, and became a radio announcer for KSL in Salt Lake City and other stations around the country. In 1974, he and his wife moved back to Israel and raised their family there as active Latter-day Saints, but he also was very involved with Daniel's mother and 2 stepsisters as Israelis of Jewish heritage. Daniel is an amazing tour guide because he knows so much about both ancient Jewish traditions, the life of Christ, and the new insights we have through the Book of Mormon and modern Revelation. One other interesting couple on the trip for us was Elder James and Sister Jenny Martino. They are currently living in Moscow, where he is the area president for the LDS Church over the Europe East area. He had been the first counselor until about 2 weeks earlier, when President Bruce Porter had passed away. Daniel Rona had previously told us a couple from Moscow would be coming on the trip, so we were excited about having someone to practice our Russian with. But Martinos had only been in Russia 6 months, and their Russian wasn't much better than ours. Friday, December 30th, 2016. We spent the morning on the hills overlooking Bethlehem from the north, the city where Christ was born. We listened to 3 stories from the Bible about Bethlehem. The first was of Rachel having Benjamin and dying in Bethlehem. The second was of Ruth the Moabite and Naomi, of how they'd returned, and Ruth cared for Naomi, her mother-in-law. The third was the story of Christ and his birth. On the hillside was a cave that sheltered us from the wind. We went inside it, a cave that would be similar to the one where perhaps Christ was born. We stood on the hillside among 800-year-old olive trees. We sang Christmas carols and imagined the shepherds on those hills in the springtime, and hearing that glorious announcement of the birth of the Savior so many years ago. The Israel Museum is the current home of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the model of the Old City of Jerusalem. When we were here in 1997, the Old City model was at the Holy Land Hotel. This was because until 1967, Jews could not go to the Old City. It was under Arab and Palestinian control. The model is at 1/50th scale, showing the wall and the Temple Mount, the palaces of Herod, Caiaphas' home, the pool of Siloam, and many other parts of the Old City. We also saw parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have to be kept under glass in very controlled temperature and humidity. There's also a photocopy of the full book of Isaiah scroll. It's about 27 feet long. It's interesting to note that it matches closely with the chapters of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon as translated by Joseph Smith, which differ a little bit from the King James Version. We next traveled west and down out of Jerusalem to a tell above Zorah. A tell is a small hill covering ancient villages, and so has many layers of archaeological information. Zorah was the hometown of Samson. We read the story of Samson and his many difficulties and the trouble he had living up to the covenant that was made when he was born. It's interesting that on top of this tell there is an altar. However, because it is round, it was obviously of pagan origin, not of Israelite origin. Jewish altars are always square, with raised corners like the Ark of the Covenant. Our last stop for the day was the Valley of Elah. It is a beautiful agricultural area. There we found a wadi, or valley with a creek down the center, which only has water when it rains. There are hills on either side. This is the place where the Philistines stood on the northern hillside and the Jews stood on the southern hillside. Rather than have the two armies fight, the Philistine giant Goliath offered to fight just one of the Jewish soldiers. The Jews were so frightened of this 9-foot-tall giant that they did not know what to do. David came along thinking he was only bringing food to his brothers who were in the army. But when he saw what was happening, he offered to fight Goliath. King Saul thought he was crazy. But David said he had the skill from practicing with his sling and rocks and the experience because he had already killed both a lion and a bear. David chose 5 smooth stones, but he only needed 1. He knocked out Goliath, then took up Goliath's own sword and cut off his head. David was prepared. He had skills, but mostly he put his faith in the Lord. All the kids on the tour really liked the story of David and Goliath. Our tour guide, Daniel Rona, gave each person a sling woven out of camel's hair and taught us all how to sling the stones like David did. We all had a great time. Rachel liked the Dead Sea Scrolls and David liked the cheese-stuffed pita bread that was toasted for lunch. December 31st, 2016. It's Saturday in Israel, the Sabbath. This morning we went up to church at the BYU Jerusalem Center on Mount Scopus. We toured the beautiful grounds and took in the view of the old city. Sacrament meeting was in a beautiful hall with huge glass windows on 3 sides with a view over the old city. The Dome of the Rock was the most prominent feature. Dawson liked being in a different country at a different church building, but he said it was still kind of the same as at home. Megan and Spencer went to a young women, young men class where there are usually no young men. The Jerusalem branch is very small. Usually BYU students are there. However, at that time, they were all home for Christmas vacation. That afternoon, we walked along the ramparts of the old city, which Ashley liked. We started at the Jaffa Gate on the west side and climbed north along the wall. Spencer's watch calculated that we walked a long way, 12,305 steps, 52 flights of stairs, and 8.25 kilometers. When we came to Herod's Gate, we climbed down and walked through the Muslim quarter. At first we were a little lost walking through the back residential streets. The neighborhood was obviously built before anyone had cars. All the homes are stone, and the streets wander up and down steps. There are little ramps some places on the steps so that hand carts and motor scooters can get around. Then we found the souk, the Arab market. Lots of little stores selling all kinds of things. Some have tourist kitsch, some have normal, practical items for those who live in the neighborhood. We found a pharmacy to buy cold pills, as Sue had caught a virus. January 1st, 2017. We awoke this morning, turned on CNN in the hotel room, and watched the preparations to drop the ball at Times Square in New York. Israel is 7 hours ahead of New York, so they were just getting ready for the new year, and we were already enjoying early morning, January 1st. This morning we drove out from Jerusalem down to the coast and stopped at the old city of Joppa or Jaffa. There we read scriptures about Jonah and the whale at the harbor and watched where he left trying to run away from the Lord. He learned that you can't run away from the Lord, and neither can we. We then climbed up to the square on the hill and stopped at the site that is the traditional home of Simon the Tanner. That is where the Apostle Peter received his vision that the gospel should be spread to all people, Jew and Gentile. Daniel Rona showed us how the cloth that came down from heaven was probably a talit, the Jewish prayer shawl, which has 4 corners with a tassel in each corner. We then drove up the seacoast to the ruins of Caesarea, the Roman city on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It was built by Herod as a resort. It has the remains of a great aqueduct. It also has a large theater with good acoustics and a hippodrome for chariot races. We could only see the foundations of the palace and other buildings that used to be there. It's now a national park. Of course, Sue just had to take off her shoes and socks to wade in the Mediterranean Sea. The water was quite nice. We continued up the coast to Haifa. We drove through the outskirts of the city up a hill to the top of the Baha'i Gardens that surround the world headquarters of the Baha'i faith. But we didn't walk down because it would have been a long hike back up. The view down over the city is beautiful, even in the haze of winter. Across the street from the Garden Walk, we saw a cannon monument. This is one of the spots where a prayer was given to dedicate Israel for the return of the Jews. Evidently, this has happened many times. The Orson Hyde monument on the Mount of Olives is just the one best known. We ended the day at a hotel on a kibbutz on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. It was dark, but we walked down to the shore anyway. The kids from several families in our group played Uno after dinner. Monday, January 2nd, 2017. In the morning, it was time to travel north into the mountains, almost to the border of Lebanon, to visit the headwaters of the Jordan River at Tel Dan. It's a beautiful national park. We hiked along the river a bit. At this point, the Jordan River is a lot of merging streams and springs that flow all around. It isn't quite a river yet, but the water is very clear. The plants all over Israel look a lot like California. It's the Mediterranean climate. We spent the rest of the day visiting sites from Christ's ministry in Galilee. He spent a lot of time there. It was far from the prying eyes of the Roman hierarchy and the Jewish leaders. It was the land of his family and heritage. We visited an octagon-shaped church on the hillside that is the probable site of the Sermon on the Mount. The well-maintained church has a central altar with stained glass windows depicting the Beatitudes. Around the floor are mosaic designs for other Christian values. In the afternoon, we came back down to the Sea of Galilee. Here we took a boat out on the sea. We told the stories of Christ and Peter walking on the water, and of Christ calming the storm. We were glad the storm was calmed for us. There had been a lot of rain during that day, but the sea was calm and our boat ride was not interrupted. Megan liked sitting on the Hill of Beatitudes overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Rachel liked the black salamander with bright yellow spots at Tel Dan. All of the kids liked the boat ride. Dawson was impressed by the 2,000-year-old boat hull we saw in the museum near the Kibbutz Hotel. It was found buried in the mud a few years ago when the Sea of Galilee was at a low point. The method to protect it and pull it out of the water without it drying out and disintegrating was pretty amazing. Our first stop today was Kiersey. This is supposed to be the site where Christ cast the legion of devils out of a man. The demons then possessed the swine that ran into the Sea of Galilee. Some of the kids climbed the hill to see the tombs where the man would have lived while he was possessed. There are ruins of a Byzantine church here. It has detailed mosaic floors, but where there were figures of people and animals, the images were broken up during the 2nd century by iconoclasts. That was the group so concerned about idol worship that they literally defaced living creature depictions in churches and even private homes. We saw that problem here and in many other places all over Israel, and again on the tombs and temples of Egypt. It is a sad reminder of the destruction of ancient religious shrines in Iran and Iraq today by Islamic extremists. It's sad when people can't savor history for history's sake, but feel the need to destroy it in the name of some interpretation of religious fundamentalism. From there off we went up to the top of Mount Tabor. There are 17 switchbacks, so we had to transfer out of our bus onto smaller vans. This is the traditional site of the Mount of Transfiguration, the true site according to the prophet Spencer W. Kimball. On the flat plateau on the peak, there is a beautiful church with side chapels to Moses and Elijah. There we read the New Testament story and Doctrine and Covenants section 110. From that modern revelation, we learned that Elijah, Moses, and Elias have already returned. The Jews just don't know it yet or accept it yet. Next stop, Nazareth, way up high on a hill overlooking the great central plain. It was a small village then and difficult to get to in Jesus' time, but it does have a gorgeous view out over the Valley of Armageddon, the prophesied site of a great world-ending battle. We ended our time in Galilee, far below sea level, and drove up a winding road and then down along a new highway to Jerusalem, some of which borders the wall between Israel proper on the eastern plain and the West Bank. This is such a difficult situation. The Arab-Palestinian people in the West Bank are essentially stateless and confined to their area. Jordan will give them passports, but it's hard for them to get out of the West Bank. It is too bad Israel didn't give them all citizenship in 1967. Arabs in other parts of Israel are much better integrated into daily life there. We could also see the new Jewish settlements being built in several places. A settlement isn't like an old small town of the western U.S. 100 years ago. But Jewish settlements are cities of 20,000 people or larger with many multi-story apartment buildings, shops, schools, and the like. Today we followed in Christ's footsteps, where he went during his life and ministry in and around the old city of Jerusalem. First stop this morning was the Temple Mount. Security to get in is like going into an airport. Photography is limited. Orthodox Jews are not allowed on the Temple Mount at all. One of the guards even asked Rachel if she was Jewish. It was raining and we hadn't brought our umbrellas, so we all got wet. Tourists are no longer allowed inside Dome of the Rock or the Alabaster Mosque. Only Muslims going to pray are allowed in the Alabaster Mosque. We could see layers of wall going back to 600 BC. There were very few people on the Temple Mount. We could walk around and see the corner that is also the likely location of the Holy of Holies, which is not within the dome. And there is a Muslim boys' school up there. We could see the boys out on a break and could look inside their classrooms. The rooms were pretty bare, desks and a whiteboard. The walls were the standard stone of the old city with no windows and no wall decor. But the boys looked pretty much like normal high school kids. No girls here, though. We walked north to the Lion's Gate, the site of the stoning of Stephen, and then through the Muslim quarter again, enjoying all the shops. The favorite thing we saw was a BYU Jerusalem t-shirt with a camel on it instead of a cougar. We next took our big bus up the Mount of Olives and hiked down into the Orson Hyde Garden. The LDS Church built a park at this site, which actually belongs to the city of Jerusalem. The LDS Church has 2 consecutive 49-year leases. That satisfies the Old Testament references to the Jubilee year each 50 years. There was once a plaque with a part of a prayer that Orson Hyde gave on October 24, 1841, to dedicate the land for the return of the scattered remnants of Judah and the rebuilding of a temple. The plaque was defaced and so has been removed. However, we read the original prayer and thought of this amazing prophecy which is now being fulfilled. The Jews are returning, and at some point there will be another temple in Jerusalem. From there we went down into the Christian quarter of the old city, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This church is occupied by 6 different Christian sects: Roman Catholic, Armenian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Egyptian Copts, Syriacs, and Ethiopians. They revere this as the site of Christ's crucifixion, and also as the location of his tomb. This site was picked by the wife of Emperor Constantine in the early 300s AD, when she made a tour of the Holy Land and designated historic sites. Inside the church building, it feels a bit like a maze. There are people everywhere all the time, and some of the church areas are under reconstruction. It's dark and has lots of hallways and small chapels. Each religion has its piece, but no one is allowed to change anything anywhere in the common areas. There is a ladder above the front door that has been there since before 1852, symbolic of the church having been closed to one of the faiths. No one is allowed to move it. We had shawarma for lunch, pita bread filled with chicken that is filed off an upright rotisserie, and also various vegetables, lettuce, tomatoes, olives, cabbage, etc. Or the falafels instead of meat, chickpea-based deep-fried balls. There is also a sauce like hummus or yogurt. We ate these a lot on other days, too. We then walked around to the outside of the Temple Mount to the south wall. Since our last visit in 1997, there has been a lot of excavation of the south steps, and there is a museum down inside. The rocks and walls go down 5,300 years. Since Jews cannot go up to the Temple Mount, there is a big canopy below in the south courtyard for Jewish weddings. Jews want to hold their weddings outside under a canopy if at all possible, a memory of the Exodus times. Climbing back into our oversized tour bus, we drove the few miles south down to Bethlehem. It is not far, but Bethlehem is in the West Bank area, which is governed by the Palestinian Authority, so everyone must go through a checkpoint to get in. The roads into Bethlehem are very crowded and very narrow. Our bus barely fit. As we tried to go around one corner, a large semi-truck was coming the other way. There was no possibility of the 2 vehicles passing, so the truck backed down about 2 blocks to let us go down the street. And then he took his turn. The whole area was crazy. The LDS branch met right on that crowded street. We had to park the bus out of the downtown area and then take minibuses up to Manger Square, the traditional site of the birth of Christ. There are various churches of the Nativity off of Manger Square. They are operated by the Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, and Armenian Christian churches. There is a cave in the basement that may be the location of where Christ was born. 2 different exact sites are claimed. There are artifacts and paintings and people crowding, and yet it's amazing to contemplate that over 2,000 years ago, this was a small village where Jesus Christ was born in humble circumstances. He began his life like any other mortal child. The minibuses took us back out of the Manger Square area. The buses are provided free of charge by one of the local shops that sells souvenirs, so of course we were expected to spend some time shopping there. There were lots of carved olive wood nativities, although none was as well done as ours that was done by the late George Lama almost 20 years ago. We chuckled at the Mormon shelf. There were carved busts of Joseph and Emma Smith, also Alma, Nephi, Lehi, and Moroni. I guess there are enough LDS tourists to make it worthwhile. Spencer liked walking around the Temple Mount. Rachel liked going to Bethlehem and the nativity scene and the traffic jams. Both liked the old city walk. Spencer said he could now really see better what he'd been studying in seminary. His view of Peter walking on the water is different now that he's been to the Sea of Galilee. Thursday, January 5th, 2017. We spent the day following the path of Jesus on the last day of his life. When Sue was teaching seminary, the material stated that we don't know what Christ did on Thursday of his last week. Our tour guide, Daniel Rona, thinks that Christ was actually crucified on a Thursday. Otherwise, he didn't spend enough days in the tomb, and it solves the problem of the missing activities on what we would call Thursday. Friday was Passover that week, so it was also a Sabbath before Saturday. Therefore, the need to get the body buried before the Sabbath could still be a proper characterization of the Thursday. But that does cause a problem for all those who traditionally mourn the crucifixion on Good Friday. Following in Christ's footsteps, we first went to the western wall of the temple. This is where observant Jews go for their prayers. It was very early in the morning, and few people were there. One area is reserved for men and another for women. There was a young man having his bar mitzvah at the wall, right next to the area for women. His mother and sisters and other female relatives were standing up by the barrier between the men's and women's sides, watching and taking pictures. Jews will not go on the top of the temple wall because it is now Muslim territory. Some of the men in our group went down into the library and observed the Orthodox prayers and the holes of continued excavation, some going down many floors below the current floor. Women are not allowed in there at all. As we left the temple area to return to the bus on the street by the south end of the Temple Mount, we came upon some street musicians. Sue asks one of them to show Dawson and Ryan how to play the shofar, the ram's horn that is blown on Jewish ceremonial occasions. The boys loved doing that. And then Keith got the musicians to play some good dance music, and he led the kids in our group as they all danced to the horror music. We found an upper room in the area where the Last Supper would have been held. The Last Supper was a Passover Seder first and foremost. Daniel Rona told us about the Seder foods and their symbols: bitter herbs to remember the hard times in Egypt, eggs for renewal, and so forth. It is quite a moving ceremony recalling the history of the Exodus. Our next visit was to the Garden of Gethsemane, high on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Temple Mount. Once again, we climbed up the hill and down into an enclosed area overlooking the city. There are several olive orchards on the side of this hill. We don't know exactly where Jesus and his apostles went, but it would have taken Jesus 2 hours to walk up here. We read Matthew chapter 26 and listened to some hymns. Each of us had time to contemplate our own relationship to Christ because of his atonement. Sue thought about the LDS hymn, "Come, come ye saints," in a new way. "'Tis better far for us to strive, our useless cares from us to drive." She'd never before thought about which of her cares are useless. Don't worry about things that are trivial. They don't matter anyway. Don't worry about things you can't change. Leave those in the hands of the Lord. We had come in from the top of the Mount of Olives, and then we all walked down the steep hill to the bus, past beautifully kept olive orchards and churches. From there we drove to the south part of the city and Caiaphas' home. There in the basement is a pit where Jesus was probably held for hours that night. Literally and symbolically, he continued to descend into the depths. We tread the actual steps where Jesus tread, climbing to Caiaphas' court. Our last stop of the day was the hill at Golgotha and the garden tomb north of the Damascus Gate. Although the Catholic and Orthodox churches favor the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the site of the crucifixion, Protestant and LDS churches believe this spot, on a hill just outside the old city, is the real location. There is a small hill above the city bus station that had a couple of small caves, making the hillside look a bit like a skull. In a storm a few years ago, the soft limestone rock formation partially fell off, so the skull-like appearance is much less pronounced. Underneath this hill to the west, a few hundred meters, is the garden tomb area. It is a lovely place, and we could see inside the tomb, and we could imagine where Jesus lay on the stone, and where Mary and his disciples found the body wrappings only because Christ had resurrected. Friday, January 6, 2017. This morning we took our bus down from the hills of Jerusalem into the Jordan River Valley. We passed Qumran and skirted the western shore of the Dead Sea along the mountainside road. On the hill above the Dead Sea is Herod's palace at Masada. There are two ways up, cable car or hiking trail. The trail can take 1 to 2 hours to hike, so we rode the car. You feel like you are way up on this high mountain plateau above the Dead Sea. The cliffs are about 1,300 feet tall, but the elevation at Masada is less than 200 feet above sea level. Lots more has been restored since we were there almost 20 years ago. Walls have been restored and black lines mark the boundary between original and restored structures. There are all different kinds of rooms and spaces. It's amazing that the Jewish zealots could live there under siege for over 3 years and have all their supplies and all their water in such a desolate place. It's also amazing how the Romans built the ramp up from the western canyon 1,000 feet below and then battered down the walls. We learned how hundreds of the zealots killed themselves before the Romans arrived on the top of the hill. That would be a hard decision. They feared for their women in the face of the Roman soldiers. We could see their point. Would it be better to see the daughters and the granddaughters dead than to have them at the mercy of 10,000 furious Roman soldiers? Next, we returned to the site at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. There are many cliffs and many canyons, some evidently still undiscovered. We saw sheep and shepherds along the side of the road. These scrolls are an amazing discovery that has given the world a very interesting view of time and place in the 1st century after Christ. The Dead Sea Resort was the highlight of the day for all of us. Swimming in that water is a little crazy. It's so thick you can't sink, so it is an unreal experience. We took a great family picture with all of us floating on our backs, hands and feet all up in the air. It's hard to even walk because you can't stand up and walk in the water. Your body just wants to be on its back, floating. We also gave mud baths to ourselves. People pay lots of money for skin treatments using mud from the Dead Sea. We just smeared it on ourselves and then washed it off. The resort area had dressing rooms, snack bar, beach chairs, a shop, and the like. There was a sign near the beach that read, "Lowest bar in the world." And it is. The Dead Sea is about 1,300 feet, more than a quarter of a mile, below sea level. Christ was baptized in the Jordan River just north of where it empties into the Dead Sea. It is yet another example of him descending below all things. After we got all cleaned up and showered off the salt water and mud, we drove north past Palestinian Jericho and many West Bank kibbutzim toward the Jordan River crossing into the country of Jordan. We didn't cross the Allenby Bridge this time because others in the group didn't have the right kinds of visas, as they hadn't entered Israel from Jordan. So we went up to the Sheikh Hussain crossing. It was an hour further north. It took an hour and a half to get through customs. That was a real pain, paying exit fees going out of Israel and entry fees going into Jordan, and then there was a shuttle bus fare for a few hundred-yard ride between the two borders. At some point during all that, we had our 10 minutes of Sabbath for the week. We left Israel and entered Jordan on Friday evening. Israeli Jewish Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday. Jordanian Muslim Sabbath is on Friday, so it ends at sundown on Friday. No church for us that weekend. We were finally on our bus on our way back to Amun. It's only 43 miles from that crossing to Amun, but it's a 2-hour drive up into the mountains. It's just a windy 2-lane road with speed bumps through every little village. We went through it in the dark. Jordan could use some freeways. It was a surprise to see how few people there were crossing the border. It's not a common thing to do. Saturday, January 7th, 2017. After spending the night back at the hotel in Amman, we got up this morning, had breakfast, and went straight to the airport far out of town. All went well there, as we flew from Amman to Cairo, Egypt, arriving about 11 a.m. The airport there was relatively busy, but we were met by guides who escorted us through customs. We stopped at the Hotel Sofitel long enough to drop off our luggage, and from there we went directly to the Citadel. This is the many hundreds of years old seat of government for Egypt. In the center it is a beautiful Alabaster Mosque, built in the 1820s to 1840s. The outside was originally all white alabaster, but due to the smog and pollution in Cairo, it is now a light tan color. The interior has beautiful high domes. It has chandeliers with lots of long, narrow glass slivers. When the wind blows through the building, they tingle and make little noises. When we asked Ashley and Megan about their favorite activity of that day, they said it was standing up on the hill in the courtyard of the mosque and seeing the pyramids 15 kilometers away to the west across the Nile at Giza. Cairo was unusually clear that day. It is normally a very polluted, smoky city, but that day the wind was blowing just enough to clear out the smog, but not so much as to raise the dust. We could see 2 great pyramids across the city. After we left the mosque, we drove down to the Nile River and had lunch at a restaurant boat. The kids were very excited to see the Nile River and actually be on it. That afternoon, we went to the Egyptian Museum. It is an amazing place. It has 125,000 artifacts from Egypt. The highlight, of course, were the artifacts and nested casket from the tomb of King Tutankhamun. All of the pieces are there that were found in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor in 1922. There are 4 large boxes that are gold-gilded wood. Inside of that were 3 layers of sarcophaguses. The inner one was solid gold. Inside that was his famous mask and his mummy. Also in the rooms were so many other pieces: his throne, several large beds, and about 400 small statues of gods that are perhaps a foot tall. These gods were to do all his labor in the next life, so he took them all as his slaves and his servants. Sunday, January 8, 2017. A day full of temples and ruins. Just outside of Cairo is Memphis, the original capital of Egypt from about 3000 BC. There's a very large alabaster statue of Ramses II, but it must have been put there later. Very little of Memphis remains because the buildings were of mud brick instead of stone, as used in later times, so the buildings must have washed away in the frequent flooding of the Nile. At Saqqara there is a small pyramid that was made as the grave for a nobleman. It isn't huge like the ones for the pharaohs, but it is interesting because of all the bas-relief scenes of daily life depicted on the walls. The big surprise was seeing our old friends Tom and Vali Greaves. We walked into the small room inside the tomb, and there they were. They are former Palo Altans. We knew that they had been in Israel the previous week because their daughter Elizabeth posted a photo from the Sea of Galilee that our son Keith saw on Facebook. Social media connects. In Saqqara, we also stopped at one of the many carpet schools. The schools take in small children and teach them to weave handmade oriental carpets. On one level, it is child labor, but the children do get paid, and they also get educated. Most of these children would not have the opportunity for an education without the carpet schools. When we came here many years ago, we took a photograph of our 12-year-old son Keith tying carpet knots. This time, it was our 11-year-old grandson Dawson doing the same. And Keith did it again. Giza is the site of the Great Pyramids. They are the last remaining artifacts of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Most of us climbed inside the Great Pyramid. There are over 200 steps up to the tomb room of the dominant Great Pyramid of Khafre. That is about halfway up the 450-foot top of the pyramid. There is no decor. These pyramids were robbed thousands of years ago and all the artifacts removed. While some of the group climbed through the pyramid, another walked about 2 kilometers around it to take pictures of the huge structure. An antique ship was found buried in the desert just below the back of the Great Pyramid, preserved in the dryness. It has been taken apart with each piece marked as to its location and then reassembled in a museum built over the site of its burial. It's a perfectly preserved example of how shipping was done up and down the Nile in the times of the pharaohs. Sunday evening was our last night all together. Rachel, Dave, and their 5 children needed to fly home on Monday to go back to school and work. We held a family meeting to share memories and reflect on the trip. We asked each person to relate one thing they learned and one thing that touched them spiritually or emotionally. Megan loved the Garden Tomb and the spirit there. She was studying the New Testament in high school seminary just before we came, so seeing the tomb made it all the more real. She also learned that bread is good go-to food. Keith learned that people were typically crucified lower to the ground, not on a hill, but just along the road outside the city wall. It took days to die, and people had to walk by and watch. He also learned that Jesus had performed many miracles up north by Capernaum. He felt the most spiritual while walking through Jerusalem. He walked where Jesus walked. Sue was spiritually touched at many places, but the one that stood out was seeing the family all sitting on the south steps below the Temple Mount. Family all together in the temple is important. Because we have temples today, we know what our family is. It's eternal. Ken learned from Daniel Rona about continuity of God's dealings with His people. He felt the reality of Christ's sacrifice. That's what makes it possible for us to forgive ourselves. He learned about Jewish, Muslim, and LDS relationships. So much of what we do today has roots in both Judaism and Islam. We all find our origins in the Old Testament, covenants and temples and traditions. Ryan liked the garden tomb. He learned that food is pretty normal here. Ashley liked the garden tomb and the boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. She learned a lot of cultural things. Dawson liked the thought of being where Jesus and His disciples had been, and the garden tomb. Dave liked being in all these places together with all of his family. He learned a lot about the meaning of Hebrew words. Spencer learned the importance of the color red as a symbol. He learned that we are fortunate to have what we have, and also that we can talk vendors' prices way down. Rachel liked walking in places where Jesus walked. She learned about the similarities between Jews and Mormons, and that there are merely different practices. She was impressed by the magnificence of the Egyptian civilizations. She felt how blessed the modern world is with technology and with cleanliness as compared to ancient times. We all arose early for our flight to Luxor in the south of Egypt. Luxor was the capital for many years after Memphis near Cairo and before the Greek and Roman conquerors founded Alexandria on the Nile Delta. The west side of the Nile has the old tombs and farms. The east side is the current city of Luxor. We first traveled west and up into the Valley of the Kings. It is a large sandstone canyon, and it looks a lot like the Red Hills of southern Utah. In this canyon are a number of caves, many of which were fashioned into tombs for pharaohs and other nobles. Other tombs were dug deep into the ground. So far, over 60 tombs have been found. There may be more. Most were found and robbed centuries ago. The last tomb opened was that of King Tut in 1922. It has been undisturbed from that time until now. Its entrance had lain hidden under the entrance of another tomb. The treasures we saw in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo came from this tomb. Photography was forbidden, but we were able to visit 3 tombs, although we could have seen others. King Tutankhamun. His mummy is still there, laid in the inner burial sarcophagus and the innermost box. There is very little wall decor. He died young after a short reign. All the spectacular treasure from his tomb is in the Egyptian Museum. We left the Valley of the Kings and traveled around to the east side of the hills to the temple of Queen Hatshepsut. According to legend, she was the daughter of an immortal mother and a god father. There's a picture on a wall of a pregnant woman going to the delivery room. Her mother is escorted by gods. In many places, her image has been chiseled out of the pictures. Her stepson, who succeeded her, did not want to admit that she had ever been queen. He changed the history to say he had been pharaoh the whole time of her reign. But historians do know that this huge, magnificent temple was built in her memory as her tomb. We next rode back to Luxor to the temple complex at Karnak in the city. This is the second largest religious shrine in the world, after Angkor Wat in Cambodia. It is huge. There are actually several temples built at different times over several centuries. The first area in Karnak was the temple of Amun-Ra. Like Jewish temples and Mormon temples, there are 3 areas in this temple. The outer court is a large open outdoor area. The middle court, the hypostyle hall is covered and has 134 huge columns with pictures and hieroglyphics in every surface. There is a clear story to let in light, the outer ring of the tall columns being a meter or so shorter than the central columns. Between the outer columns on the vertical wall is a grate-like structure. For the inner court, or Holy of Holies, only the royalty and the high priest were allowed to go in there. Also at Karnak is the obelisk of Hatshepsut, which is 30 meters high. There is also a door to a newer mosque up about 15 feet high. It was at ground level in the 11th century because the original Egyptian temple had filled with sand. Near the river is the Luxor Temple, at one time connected to the Karnak temple complex a kilometer downstream in inland. This is the location of the tallest obelisk in Egypt. There is a long alley of human sphinxes. Opposite is an inner court, which is interesting because there are Roman frescoes painted on top of earlier Egyptian carvings. The innermost room has one wall from the time of Ramses II. The opposite wall was made for Alexander the Great, showing him as the king of Egypt. It was constructed about 1,300 years after Ramses II. After our day at Karnak and Luxor, we took the 7 Dymmocks and Mills to the airport for their flight back to Cairo. From there, they returned home, while the remaining 3 of us boarded a riverboat for a cruise up the Nile River toward the Aswan Dams in the south. Tuesday, January 10th, 2017. This morning we slept in. After getting up at 3:45 a.m. on Monday, it felt so good to sleep. We awoke up at about 7:45 a.m. after 9 hours of sleep. We had a lazy day. The riverboat was one of the many floating hotels. Once there were more than 300. Now only about 40 remain to carry passengers along the Nile, because tourism is down so much since the Arab Spring uprising in 2011. We had ordered breakfast in our cabin for 8 a.m. There was a jogging track on the top deck. There was even a small swimming pool with an infinity edge looking out over the stern of the boat. About 1 p.m. we began to sail south up the Nile. Then lunch was served. The dining room is on the lowest deck, so the half-room height windows on the inside are at water level on the outside. It was fascinating to watch the wake of the boat as we plied the Nile. That evening we reached the locks. It took us only about an hour or so to traverse the locks, as there was no wait. In the past, the wait could be as long as 24 hours, when there were as many as 300 riverboats on the river. Egypt is a land of old and new. Donkey carts hauling bananas while the drivers are talking on cell phones. Mud huts with no roof, it never rains, and a satellite TV dish on the top. Smoke rising from burning sugarcane fields with huge power lines coming down from Aswan Dam. 3,000-year-old obelisks standing near tall cell phone towers. Which will last the longest into the future? Wednesday, January 11th, 2017. Our first stop today as we cruise up the Nile was at Edfu, a temple built by the Ptolemaic Empire starting in about 250 BC to about 57 BC. It has a lot of Greek influence because it should have been conquered by the Greeks of that time. The temple is huge and very well preserved. A lot of the faces have been chiseled away, however. The early Christians and later the Muslims believed that any depiction of living people or animals was idol worship. So they literally defaced statues and carvings and paintings wherever they could. The temple is built in 3 sections as at Karnak: an open-air court, the middle hypostyle hall, and the inner sanctuary. Then there are a lot of storage rooms or offices around the outside of the inner sanctuary. The amazing thing is that all of the walls, every square inch of everything, is covered with carvings. The ones on the outside walls are carved in. The ones on the inner walls are all carved in bas relief. This is a temple to the god Horus. There are pictures of him in his fight with his uncle Seth, who is represented as a hippopotamus. Horus was the falcon god. There are cartouches and hieroglyphics of the signs of the temple on the walls. It means the house of God. The half-height walls between the columns between the outer courtyard and the hypostyle hall are there to allow light into the hall, just as at Karnak. In one corner of the temple there is a small basement. This was the Nile meter. The priest would allow the water in there so they could measure the flood, how fast the water was flowing, and how high it was rising. This civilization was an economy of temple and royalty. The amount of taxes that people were charged each year was based on the size of the flood. In a good, fertile year, the taxes were higher. If the flood was low, the crops were poor, so the taxes were lower. This reminds us of Joseph in Egypt when he took the stores of grain and materials and warehoused them during the 7 good years, so the people would have them during the 7 years of poor floods and drought. We set sail again, having a lovely morning up on the top deck watching the Nile float by, followed by a good barbecue lunch up on the sun deck. It was a perfect day. There was a very slight breeze, and the sunshine was a little too warm if you chose to sit in it, but it was perfect in the shade. In the afternoon we came to Qumran. This temple is a mile or 2 inland from the Nile shore, so we had to take a horse cart from the boat. This is an interesting temple because it is built to 2 gods. Rather than having one central aisle from the outside court through the hypostyle center court and into the sanctuary, it has 2 center aisles. One is to the god Horus, the falcon god. The other is the god Sobek, the crocodile god. This temple also has a wonderful example of an Egyptian calendar. It shows the month. The symbol for the flood shows that it was July with the day and the date of the month. It turns out that the Egyptians were the first ones to develop a calendar of 365 days. Then they realized that they started to get a day off every 4 years. They started with the lunar calendar, but realized that that didn't work out exactly. It turns out in Egypt that the North Star disappears for 70 days each year, so by putting together the time of disappearance with the time of the annual flood, they could make a calendar that lasted exactly 1 year. To return to our boat, we were supposed to take the same horse cart that we had taken to come to the temple. But there were so many people and carts and horses and everyone yelling that we didn't think we'd ever find our driver. We found one of them and piled 4 of us in one cart and made it safely through the crowded streets back to the boat. At 5:20 p.m. the sun set, and we could hear the Muslim call to prayer coming from the minarets all around us on both sides of the river. It is a reminder, even to us who are Christian, that we also need to pray more. After dinner, there was a Galilee costume party in the lounge. We weren't going to dress up, but Keith bought a costume on the ship, so Sue bought one too. Ken's was just rented. Keith stayed late at the party with a family from Washington, D.C. that we met on the boat. Ken and Sue enjoyed one dance, took a few pictures, made a video of the whirling dervish, and went back to the cabin to pack. Thursday, January 12th, 2017. We arrived in the city of Aswan in mid-morning. This is as far south as the Nile cruise boats can go because of the dams. We had another great breakfast on the boat and then left at 8 a.m. and went for a sail on a felucca. That's a Nile River sailboat, a small boat that was once used for transporting goods. Now they're just tourist boats. It might have held about 20 people if it had been full, but today it was just the three of us and our guide, Manal. We toured around the islands of Aswan for an hour or so. It was beautiful, a slight breeze. There were cows and goats grazing on the islands and a very pretty city. Returning to the riverboat, we collected our luggage and got into a small tourist van. First, we drove out to see a granite quarry and an unfinished obelisk. It's hard to imagine how the Egyptians could have ever gotten anything so large out of there. But it is close to the Nile, and they could roll the big blocks down to the river, put them on barges, and float them down the Nile during the flood season to Luxor or Cairo or even Alexandria. After visiting the quarry, we took a small motorboat to see the Philae Temple. This temple is on an island in the middle of the lake behind the old Aswan Dam, but it used to be on a different island. After the old Aswan Dam was built in the 1800s, the temple was partially underwater. It was filled up with silt. So in the 1970s, when other artifacts were being moved from above the new Aswan Dam, the temple at Philae was also moved from its ruined location to another island nearby in the Nile. The site was prepared, and then every single brick and rock and block of granite was moved to the new place and put back together. It took about 4 years. Visitors have to take a small motorboat to get across from the city of Aswan to the island where the Philae Temple is. Our driver was a little boy. He said he was about 14, but he looked probably closer to 12. But he was very good at his job. We finally found a spot on the Philae Island where the Nile looked clean enough and Sue could get to it. She was able to sit on a rock and put her feet in the water. Fortunately, there were no crocodiles nearby. Back on the shore, we drove the road across the old dam and then 4 kilometers up the Nile to the new high dam. It was built between 1962 and 1970 with the help of the Russians. The huge Lake Nasser is behind the dam, which stretches 500 kilometers all the way south to Sudan. When the lake was being filled, it threatened to bury many ancient artifacts. Many of them were moved to higher ground, but we will never know if there are undiscovered treasures under all that water. Because of the high dam, the Nile no longer floods each year. But the areas of traditional flooding are irrigated, so the Nile Valley is still a rich agricultural area providing fruits, vegetables, cotton, dates, and the like to the people of Egypt and many other areas of the world. The high dam is an earthen dam, 1 kilometer high, 1 kilometer thick at its base, and 4 kilometers wide. We sat on top of the dam in a small shaded garden to eat our box lunches. It was a beautiful, sunny day. We enjoyed sitting under the trees with the breeze blowing up the Nile. The airport to return home is just southwest of the dam. That afternoon we flew back to Cairo, where we spent the night and then returned home through New York. The time on the Nile cruise had been a good wind down after all the busy touring. We really were ready to go home.